What do you make of what is going on with the world right now, with Washington pitting itself against Beijing, or should I say Donald Trump perhaps pitting himself against the rest of the world here, Nuru?
Well, I think it's a bit of a scary time for the global economy. There is a sharp slowdown on global economic growth. We went from an expansion to a slowdown. And I think that there are risks of a global recession and financial crisis by next year. And I would say among the tail risks, there are two very big. One, the risk of a Cold War on tech and trade and geopolitically between U.S. and China. I think that what has happened in Osaka is not a success. The two sides are completely disagreeing on all the main issues regarding trade, IPR,
but is it about trade?
So on.
Is it about trade?
It's not just about trade. I would say trade is actually the least of the problems right now. We have now a global rivalry between U.S. and China about who's going to be controlling the industries of the future, AI, automation, for 5G and all the other major industries. There is a new two-cities trap and a Cold War between U.S. and China. And it's not going to be easy to find a solution to this problem. And the consequences of this trade and tech war and Cold War will be the beginning of deglobalization, balkanization, and decoupling of the global economy. We'll have to redo the entire global tech supply chain. That's going to lead to disruption. And eventually, by next year, if this escalates, there will be a global recession.
So this is the fragmentation of what's going on with supply chains, the fragmentation of geopolitics, if you will, or the deglobalization, yes. I think you referred to as well. This is a longish process, medium term for this to happen. So how badly does the economy suffer as we rejig this? And who's to say that we don't have the old order restored at some point, or is the old order gone forever?
Well, it's a medium-term rivalry between U.S. and China, but even in the short run, let's assume that there is not an agreement. There has been a truce, but not an agreement on trade. There is not going to be an agreement on Huawei. The U.S. is out to try to destroy Huawei by cutting it off from semiconductor and other components because there is a national security element of it. Therefore, in my view, this truce is not going to lead to an agreement on trade or tech. Then the tension is going to escalate.
Huawei has been thrown a lifeline.
It's been thrown a lifeline, but they pull the plug on Huawei any day. Suppose that the negotiation on trade failed, then they're going to decide, even tomorrow, that Huawei cannot use it. And as it is right now, nobody's going to use the Huawei smartphones or the 5G networks because anybody who's going to use it today, tomorrow, maybe a system that is not working in terms of software or hardware. So the global business of Huawei has been already effectively semi-destroyed, not formally but informally, and therefore this rivalry is actually much more serious about tech, and the deglobalization not going to be just about trade in soybeans or in LNG. Who cares about that? We have a global supply chain in everything to do with tech and manufacturing that depends on integration of the global economy. And once you decouple, once you balkanize, we're going to have a global recession.
Are we seeing signs of it already? I mean, I refer to manufacturing data globally, particularly among developed states. We do see that turning down, a slowdown definitely, if not a recession in some countries, a manufacturing recession. You see some of that spreading into the service side of the economy. And on top of that, global trade, that's also falling and falling quite rapidly. So how bad does it get before things improve? Or do they improve?
In my view, they're going to improve because my baseline is one in which, first of all, there'll be a trade and tech war between U.S. and China. It's going to get worse. And secondly, there's another major potential tail risk for the global economy. If the tension between the U.S. and Iran escalate, oil prices might spike. And if they spike, you could have another stagflation, like it happened in 73 with the Yom Kippur War, or 79 with the Iranian Revolution, or 1990 with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So you have two major conflicts, geopolitical, one between U.S. and China, and the other one between U.S. and Iran, who can derail the global economy. As you pointed out, manufacturing is already in a recession globally. It's affecting services. The tech sector is a slowdown. And given the policy uncertainty about trade, about tech, there is an option value of waiting. So if you are any entrepreneur, any business, any corporation in Europe, in Asia, United States, in Middle East, in China, what do? You stop doing investment. There has already been in the data a collapse of capex. And once capex is down, then industrial production is down, employment is down, and you have the beginning of a global recession that starts in tech, then in manufacturing, then in industry, and then goes to services. And we're seeing it in the data.
When does it actually then permeate into actually becoming something which you can see? You can see it materially, but in terms of when do you actually call it a recession? How bad a recession? How deep a recession? I think you were saying it was going to be 2020. It seems to me that you perhaps think it's a bit further away than it is likely to be even.
Well, in manufacturing, we are already effectively in a recession, both in the tech sector and broadly speaking. Today is a slowdown in the global economy. In my view, it's going to take a few months until this negotiation between U.S. and China are going to fail, both on the trade side and on the tech side, and the tension between U.S. and Iran are going to escalate in a way it's going to spike oil prices, going to lead to another supply-side shock on the global economy. So you have two supply-side shocks in the global economy, one coming from trade and tech, and the other one coming from oil. Both of them are going to reduce economic activity and increase prices. Those are stagflationary shocks like 73, like 79, like 1990. And we know in those three episodes before, we had a global recession. I expect that that recession, if these shocks do materialize, is going to happen in 2020.
Okay. I think you made your point about when that's going to happen and the reasons behind it, but is there anything that we can do to avert it? Is there some sort of panacea that you could come up and sort of being Dr. Doom? Can you be actually Dr. Light for a change?
Well, central banks are going to ease. There'll be fiscal stimulus, but I think that we are limited in two dimensions. First of all, there is not much headroom. Even the Fed last time around could go from 525 down to 0. Right now, they're 2.5. They have only 250 basis points of headroom. And then what? They're going to go back to what? Negative policy rates, or they're going to do more QE. In the case of Japan and Eurozone, ECB, and rest of Europe, they're already in negative policy rates. They're already doing QE, and therefore their policy space is more limited on the monetary side. On the fiscal, we're living in a world in which we have high budget deficit and debt, and therefore the fiscal stimulus and fiscal space is limited. And politically, the ability to backstop corporations, banks, and households like we did during the global financial crisis is limited. It's limited for two reasons. Some sovereigns are bankrupt, and the political economy is right now, nobody's going to want to bail out the bankers once more. And therefore, politically, there'll be constraints to be able to bail out. So compared to the past, markets right now are rallying because they're hoping there is going to be a trade deal between U.S. and China. And in the meanwhile, the Fed in July is going to start cutting rates, followed by the ECB, the BOJ, PBOC, and everybody else. But those cuts, like in 2007, the Fed went from 5.5 to 0. Did they avoid the recession? No. The recession was severe because the shocks were severe. The stock market fell from peak to trough by 60%. So all this easing is going to maybe diminish the extent of the market collapse, is going to diminish the amount of that recession. But if these shocks are large enough, a full trade, tech, and Cold War between U.S. and China, and a war between U.S. and Iran that spikes all prices, there is no way with two big shocks, one of them is enough to lead the global economy to a recession. Two of them are going to lead to a severe recession. And therefore, the policy response in the short run, like in 2007, leads market to rally. But once the economic collapse does occur, the market is going to collapse, like in every other recession.
I was asking you to be Dr. Light here. You become even more doomish.
No, not become doomish. I say you're going to diminish the impact on the markets by having monetary easing. But you're limited in how much you can ease.
Okay, what needs to be done then? If we have no efficacy of fiscal policy in effect, because everybody's up to their eyeballs in debt, then we have no efficacy for monetary policy. Is monetary policy now largely redundant? Where does that leave policy itself?
We're constrained compared to the global financial crisis. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, and bailout policies are more constrained than they were 10 years ago. I'm not saying there is no policy space, but it's limited, and if the shocks are large enough, that policy stimulus, however constrained it is not going to be able to prevent a recession, and a financial crisis is going to be at best able to diminish its severity, like in 2007, 2009.
Dr. Rubini, is the fundamental problem that we've not been able to inflate our debts away?
Well, we have had certainly a problem of debt deflation. We've been trying to monetize those debts with quantitative easing, forward guidance, negative policy rates, and so on. But the reality is that 10 years after the global financial crisis, overall, around the world, private and public debt as a share of GDP is higher than before. Debt servicing ratios are low today because, of course, with QE you have near zero policy rates and long rates are very low. But even if government bond yields for a safe country were to stay low or go lower, first of all, there are some sovereign, like in Italy or emerging markets, that are near insolvent, so credit spreads for sovereign can go higher. And we've had a massive increase in corporate debt, and if you have a spike in credit spreads, high yield, high grade, CLOs, and so on, you could have actually a massive increase in debt servicing ratios, even with low interest rates on safe assets like government bonds in Germany or US or Japan.
We just got a headline from Li Keqiang here saying the China economy has seen a steady growth in the first half and in the proper range here as well. Do you believe him?
Well, the data suggests that there was a massive slowdown of growth in Q4 and second half of last year. Then they did a monetary, fiscal and credit stimulus. Growth stabilized in Q1, but the latest data from China, whether you look at trade, PMI, industrial production, capex, suggests that there is the beginning of another sharp slowdown. And this is before we have a full-scale trade war between US and China. If you're a Chinese private sector entrepreneur, capex is sharply down because there is massive amount of policy uncertainty. So there is a significant slowdown of growth. It's not a recession, but we expect that this year China is going to have a massive slowdown, and like the past, they're going to do another round of monetary, fiscal and credit stimulus. It's going to increase the debt ratio. It's already 250% of GDP. So they're trying to kick the can down the road, but if you have a shock to trade and to tech that is large enough, if Huawei is effectively destroyed, even their own policy stimulus is not going to be able to prevent something of a harder landing in China.
You haven't mentioned much about indebtedness. You just mentioned it about China. That's why I'm picking you up on that. But indebtedness, globally speaking, because of QE and the ballooning of some assets, perhaps not the right assets that they had in mind to begin with, is that worrisome for you?
Well, as I pointed out, debt ratios around the world, private and public, in advanced economies and emerging markets, whether you look at the private sector, household, corporates, banks, or the public sector or foreign debt, overall, those debt ratios are high. So far, debt servicing ratios have been low because short rates were close to zero, and because of QE, long rates were also very low. What I pointed out is that in spite of having low debt servicing ratio with high debt ratios and high deficits, if you have a spike in credit spreads in the private sector, high yield, high grade, CLOs or leverage loans or you name it, or in the public sector for countries that are near insolvent, even with low government bond yields in safe countries, you could have a spike in debt servicing ratio. It's going to make those debt ratios that are right now under control unsustainable in terms of their servicing.
I mean, you're painting a very gloomy picture again, but I'm just looking at, we saw the GFC, it was a recession, certainly a very deep recession. How far are we in danger of going into a depression the next time around?
Well, I don't think there's going to be a depression, because once we're going to go into that severe recession next time around, then essentially central banks are going to do stuff that is even more unconventional, not just forward guidance, not just zero policy rates, not just QE, not just credit easing, not just negative policy rates. They're going to start doing helicopter drop of money that are variants of what the modern monetary theory says. There'll be massive fiscal stimulus, and this fiscal stimulus is going to be monetized, but that's going to happen when the recession becomes severe enough that then governments are desperate, and they're desperate because populists are going to come to power, going to go to even more radical, unconventional monetary policy. We'll have the equivalent of helicopter drop of money, permanent monetization of deficits and debt. That's effectively what the proponents of the modern monetary theory are suggesting. That's the direction we're going to be going.
What would you do?
I think that compared to the risk of going to the Depression and having then World War III, because the Great Depression eventually led to an economic and political and geopolitical disaster, most likely we're going to go into extreme unconventional, even more unconventional policy reaction. But the severity of the shocks, if you have a trade war between U.S. and China, if you have a tech war, if the relation with the U.S. and Iran escalate, is going to lead to a severe recession.
It's quite serendipitous. You've got two headlines coming from Li Keqiang here. First of all, he's saying that China will keep economic growth stable. Then he said that they will not flood the economy with excess liquidity. Your reaction to that?
Well, every time in the past there has been a growth slowdown, they give up on their objective of deleveraging, of reducing overcapacity, and they do new rounds of credit fuel fixed investment, monetary easing, fiscal easing, credit easing, and letting the currency weaken to backstop the economy, because their official goal is to maintain growth rate officially at 6%, and therefore when the shock occurs, they give up on financial stability and they go for growth. They've been doing it in 2008, in 2009, 2012, 2015, 2016, 2018. They're going to do it in 2019 and 2020. They've been doing it. Talk is cheap. Every time there is a shock to growth, the Chinese react by doing stuff that is another credit fuel fixed investment boom in infrastructure that leads to more debt and leverage in the economy. And that's why the debt ratio is now 250% of GDP and rising.
Okay, let's just take a look now, as we've also got this trade conflict, as it were, how it's spreading now to others. We've got India as well now in the crosshairs. We've had the EU for a while too. How bad does that get, and how does it then become, in aggregate, something which just you end up into almost a negative feedback loop?
Well, you know, Trump is a protectionist. He was elected on a slogan of America First, make America great again, buy American, hire American. So it started with steel and aluminum, then was other goods and services, then he had a trade fight with Mexico and Canada, then with China, then with Europe. Now he wants to get out of the WTO. He's a protectionist, and all his policies have been going in the direction of restriction to trade in goods, in services, in capital, in labor, in technology, in data. This is the beginning of deglobalization and balkanization of the global economy. There will be a decoupling between US and China. The world is going to be divided in two trading blocks, one based on the US and one based on China. The problem is that most countries in the world, even the allies of the US, they do more trade and investment with China than with the US, this formal ally, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe. All these countries want to do business with China and US, and once there is going to be this decoupling, the US is going to say you are with us or against us. And China is going to say the same. So it's going to negatively affect Europe and Asia and the rest of the world, because people have to choose on which side they are, and they don't want to take part. And that's going to slow down, and it's going to lead to recession in the rest of the world.
Can it be that binary, surely?
Over time, it's going to become binary. Once you have restriction to trade in goods, in services, in capital, in labor, in technology, you use my 5G or the Chinese 5G. You use my AI or the Chinese AI. You use my robotic and automation or the Chinese. Even the toasters are going to have a chip that is 5G. So even the toaster, even the consumer electronic, even the smartphones, they're going to say, if it's a Chinese one with a chip, there's the Huawei 5G, I don't want your toasters. So it's going to be complete decoupling of the global economy, not just the tech sector, because everything, even the car system that are autonomous, have to be based on what? On a 5G system. Can you allow the Chinese to be controlling your 5G system for your autonomous car in the US? Of course not. They could boycott it and switch it off any point, and vice versa for the Chinese. So it's going to affect every good and every service once we're going to have this decoupling. It's going to occur, of course, over time, not overnight, but it's a complete radical change, regime change. We've lived for the last 30 years with greater globalization, but after World War I, we also had a period in which from globalization we went to deglobalization and balkanization and decoupling of the global economy. This time around is going to be worse. When there was the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union was the declining power, 150 million people, growth collapsing, and there was no trade with the US and the Soviet Union. Between US and China is different. China is going to be the largest economy in the world, 1.4 billion people, and they're economically becoming stronger, and there's massive trade in goods and services and capital and labor and technology between US and China. So this divorce is going to get ugly compared to the divorce between US and Soviet Union, because there was no trade between US and Soviet Union. This time around, you're going to damage the global economy.
There wasn't wheat, of course. We know there was
a little bit of wheat. Yeah, like there is corn now.
Yeah. Let's See, okay, is that why these fears? I mean, we saw at the beginning of May how the trade negotiations between China and the US fell apart, whatever. There's a trade truce now, but then we saw gold and we saw Bitcoin, cryptocurrency suddenly moving and rallying, and have rallied ever since, largely speaking, is seen as a haven, and that's why you're here. We're here to talk about blockchain as well. That's what you've just been talking about on stage. Is it really a store of value?
They're not. First of all, gold went up 10% and now down again. Cryptocurrencies are not even currencies, it's a joke. To be a currency, you have to be a unit of account. No goods or services priced in Bitcoin or any other shitcoin. It's not a store of value, it's stable. The price of Bitcoin has fallen literally in a week by how much? 30%, okay? Goes up 20% one day, collapses in the next week by 30%. And it's not a means of payment. Nobody, not even this blockchain conference, accepts Bitcoin for paying for their conference fees, because you can do only 5 transactions per second with Bitcoin. With the Visa system, you can do 25,000 transactions per second. There is a fintech revolution where billions of people are using digital money for billions of transactions a day. Is in China, is Alipay or WeChat Pay, is UPI system in India, is M-Pesa in Kenya and Africa, is Venmo or PayPal in the United States. These are things that have nothing to do with blockchain, nothing to do with crypto. They're based on AI, big data, and IoT. This is the future of digital money. It's not crypto. Okay. Crypto is nonsense. It's a failure. Nobody's using it for any transaction. It's trading one shitcoin for another shitcoin. That's the entire trading occurs in this space, where there's price manipulation, spoofing, wash trading, pump and dumping, front running. It's just a big criminal scam and nothing else.
I'm going to just find out your thoughts on whether this can actually be adopted, though, at some point, because everything is poo-pooed in its nascency. Maybe you should give it some time. Why are you against it so much?
Listen, it's been around for 10 years. 10 years, what are the killer apps in this space? There are none. 75% of these distributed apps, what are they? CryptoKitties, casino games, and literally Ponzi games. And the remaining 25% is decentralized exchanges that have no liquidity and nobody's using it. 99% of all crypto trading is occurring on centralized exchanges. So much for decentralization. So we've had it for 10 years. This is not the beginning of the internet. A decade into the launch of the World Wide Web, you had 1 billion users, then the next decade became 2 billion. In the first decade of crypto, with much more sophisticated technologies than before, the number of official users are 50 million, the number of unofficial, those real users, is 20 million. Nobody is using crypto for any goods or services. There is no killer app. There's not the equivalent of a World Wide Web, of websites, of email, of all the applications that occur in the internet. Comparing to the internet is a joke. It's just peddling and talking your book. It's total, utter nonsense.
Okay, you are going to be on stage tomorrow morning with Arthur, and he was talking to us earlier. I asked him a few questions. Some of the questions you'll be able to hear some of the questions I asked him, and we can just hear what he makes of your comments that you've been making about cryptocurrencies. What's going on here? He was questioning your finances, and you got rather fragrant with him, didn't you?
I mean, he's a hater. He's a no-coiner. He's been bashed.
A no-coiner?
A no-coiner.
Is that the new pejorative word for people who don't believe it?
Someone who doesn't have any Bitcoin and watched the price rocket in their face over the past few years. So,
it's a bit harsh, isn't it?
I think so, but I think it's true.
So are you all those things?
That's total nonsense. You know, Arthur Hayes is somebody who created BitMEX, and he was boasting it live because he said there is a whole millions of what he called degenerate gamblers, and they're retail suckers, retail investor suckers, and we're going to create something where they can leverage not 10 times, not 50 times, but 100 times. Is worse than those drug pushers who give you crack cocaine for free to get you addicted and then lead you to be broke. There are millions of people who have gone bankrupt because of his policies and his business, okay? He's a drug dealer. That's what he does. He's a scammer.
Okay, Dr. Rubini, I'd just like to add that those are Dr. Rubini's views and don't actually reflect the views of us here at Bloomberg.